D&D number 6, The Worth of Souls in Jesus' Name, Chapter 2. They'd come south, Mickey thought. It had to be south. The sun was just coming up and it was already warm. Even in June, mornings in the state of Washington are cool. She tugged on the cuffs just to make sure they hadn't miraculously come undone during the night. Peering down toward the foot of the bed, she looked to see if Butch was still there and was relieved to find that she was alone. He'd surprised her last night by staying in the room with her. Arriving with a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and a bottle of water, he'd uncuffed her, allowed her to sit up, and then cuffed just one hand to the bed so that she could feed herself. When she'd finished, he told her to lie back down. She'd begged him to leave the cuffs off. Patiently, as if she were a child, he gently pushed her down and cuffed both her hands to the bed again. He then turned off the overhead light, sat down in the chair at the foot of the bed, propped his feet up, turned on a flashlight, and opened a book. A few hours later, it woke her when he'd switched off the light. She hadn't expected him to stay, and she wondered if he was actually guarding her or possibly protecting her from Richard. After all, it wasn't like she could go anywhere with her hands cuffed to the bed. So, she reasoned, Butch must be protecting her, and that meant he just might have a heart or a conscience, and she might be able to appeal to him, wear him down, and talk him into letting her go. The idea bolstered her mood. She definitely needed something to bolster her mood. She'd never thought about how vulnerable someone is when they're bound in some fashion. The feeling of being absolutely and completely dependent on whoever is supposed to be seeing to her needs, she found terrifying. From the smallest thing like unable to scratch her nose to the biggest thing like not being able to defend herself against an attacker. She was helpless. Not only that, but claustrophobia was becoming a problem. Just lying here thinking about it right now, knowing she's not free to run, was making her want to scream. Her heart began to beat faster and beads of perspiration popped out all over her body. Tears welled in her eyes. She tugged on the cuffs, lightly at first and then harder, choking on a sob, and panicked. She twisted her body until her arms crossed and she was on her stomach, and then she rose up onto her knees and the panic began to subside. She sniffed and leaned forward to wipe her eyes on her wrist. The door opened and Butch stepped in. He carried a cereal breakfast bar and a bottle of water. Setting them down on the table beside the bed, he leaned over her. It's so funny. A train never comes unless I start reading. Okay. Setting them down on the table beside the bed, he leaned over her. What are you trying to pull? Nothing, she said softly. I was afraid you weren't coming back, and I panicked. His lips pressed tightly together as if he didn't believe her. Really? I'm just glad to see you. He frowned. Well, you won't say that in a few days. He leaned over and unlocked the cuffs. Keeping in mind her plan to convince him to let her live, she offered a timid smile. That feels better. Thank you. He rolled his eyes at her and pocketed the cuffs, grabbed her by the wrist, and pulled her out the door. She stumbled against his back when he stopped abruptly to open the bathroom door. Glancing around quickly, she found Richard sitting on the sofa, scarfing up donuts. He looked up at her, his eyes sweeping over her body before he turned back to watch the small, older television. Butch shoved her into the bathroom. Don't bother trying to run this time. I'll be right here next to the door. I won't, she assured him meekly. When she emerged from the bathroom a few minutes later, he grabbed her wrist. He'd started to push her back into the bedroom when she looked up at the television and gasped. Glancing over, he saw Mickey's family being interviewed on TV. Can I see, please? He didn't let her move any closer. Still, he allowed her to stay there beside the bedroom door while she watched the 8 o'clock news. Her mother spoke into the camera, asking the kidnappers to please not hurt her daughter. Marion's hand rested on Marissa's shoulder. The camera zoomed in to show the tears coursing down the young girl's cheeks. Oh, Rissa, Mickey said softly, her throat clogging with emotion. The camera pulled back and focused in on her stepfather, who was now speaking. "We'll do anything you want," he said. "Just bring her back." Mickey's brow furrowed. He sounded emotional, like he was just sick over her. She knew that wasn't true. He'd hated her as long as he'd known her, and she hated him. Still, they'd lived somewhat civilly together for 11 years, mostly ignoring each other, except for the times she'd angered him. As was her habit, she forced those memories away. "He's a good actor," she thought as she watched him. She'd realized that over the years. Of course, he couldn't let the world know theirs was not the perfect family. The world believed he'd fallen in love with the poor single mother whose husband had deserted her and her child. The mighty Talman Daly had stepped in and rescued them, and in his most charitable of hearts, he'd adopted the child as his own, changing her name from Mackenzie Lee Benson to Mackenzie Lee Daly. Publishing the ugly thoughts from her mind, she listened as the press was allowed to ask questions of the local chief of police, even though Mickey was sure the case was being handled by the FBI. "Sir," one reporter asked, "have you received a ransom note yet? Can you tell us how much the kidnappers are demanding?" "We have not received a ransom note yet," the chief answered. Mickey looked quickly back up at Butch. "Why not? Who's supposed to send the ransom note? How long are they going to wait?" "That's enough," Butch snapped. Grabbing her wrist, he jerked her into the bedroom and cuffed one hand to the bed. Shoving the breakfast bar at her, he turned and left the room. She felt sick. Yet she knew she needed to keep up her strength if she was going to somehow escape. She had to believe she could. She had to act as if that time was coming. And so she forced herself to unwrap the breakfast bar and eat every single crumb and drink every drop of water. As she ate, her mind raced back to the fact that no ransom note had been sent thus far. That didn't mean one wouldn't be sent. Surely someone would ask for a ransom. Yet, what if they didn't? And then she remembered that it didn't really matter one way or the other, because Butch already said she was dead either way. Well, if no one intended to bargain for her life, then she would bargain for it herself. She was bound and determined to soften Butch up enough to make him want to save her life. She didn't see him again until lunchtime, and he brought her more water and another peanut butter sandwich. "Thank you," she said sweetly. "Stop saying that," he ordered as he took a seat in his chair. He watched her as she ate, and she looked up and smiled at him. "Can I ask you a question?" "What?" he grumbled impatiently. "Have you killed anybody before me?" At first she thought he wouldn't answer, and then he gruffly said, "Yes." "Any women?" "No, but don't get your hopes up. I'll do what I'm ordered to do. And whoever's in charge is going to order you to kill me eventually, right?" "Yes." "Whether the ransom is paid or not." He remained silent. "Butch, is that right? I'm dead either way?" "Yes." "Then why wait?" "What?" "Why wait for the order? If I'm dead either way, why not just get it over with? You wouldn't have to babysit me or feed me or worry that I'll escape." "I was told to take you and hold you until the order to kill comes down. That's what I'm going to do." "But maybe there's a chance this guy will change his mind. Maybe since he wants to wait, maybe it's because he thinks there may possibly be a change of plans." Butch looked into her eyes for several seconds as he considered the idea. His eyes hardened. "And maybe it's because he needs to prove you're still alive in order to get the money," Butch returned. "Listen, kid, don't get your hopes up." He picked up his book and opened it. "Well, he certainly won't get any money if he doesn't send a ransom note, right?" Butch didn't answer. "So maybe there will be a ransom note," she surmised, "and maybe there will be a bargain for her life, and maybe the ransom will be paid, and maybe they will all work it where the kidnappers get caught and she gets rescued, and maybe her stepfather really is upset about the whole thing, and maybe somewhere deep down inside he actually cares enough for her that he will pay the ransom. Yeah, and maybe the moon is really made of blue cheese." He didn't care. She wasn't worth a wooden nickel to him. She was quiet for a while, pushing herself up against the metal headboard. She stretched her legs out in front of her and looked Butch over. He had short, dark hair and light gray eyes. His nose was large and crooked like it had been broken a few times. A scar ran across the top of his forehead as if someone had tried to scalp him. His mouth was a firm, straight line. He was a large man with large hands, and suddenly she could see those hands closing around her throat. Swallowing, she looked away. It had grown quite warm, and sweat trickled down her forehead and between her breasts. After an hour or so of silence and heat, Butch put his book down, rose, and went to open the window. "Thank you," she said, as he sat back down. He only rolled his eyes at her. "Butch?" He blew out an angry breath. "What?" "Do you have a family?" He didn't answer. "I mean, everyone has a family. Mother, father, brother, sister, aunt, uncle, cousin. Everybody has somebody. You were born, so you had to have a mother." "Well, if I did, I don't remember it." "Anyone else?" "Nope." "Who raised you?" "Some crackhead lady who used me to help her get her fix for the day." "What happened to her?" "Some guy cut her heart out." Mickey had to regroup after that answer. Still, she felt she was making progress. He was at least talking to her. She had to keep going. "Is there no one you have ever cared about, like maybe a girlfriend?" He kept his eyes focused on the pages of the book while he spoke. "I had one once. Met her when I worked for a landscaping company. The daughter of some rich guy." "What happened to her?" "Her father found out I was banging his daughter and had me arrested." "Oh, how old was she?" "She was 17, and I knew plenty well what was what." "She was 17 and knew plenty well what was up, and I wasn't her first." "How old were you?" 18. "So really it wasn't like her father tried to make it out to be. You were both really just kids." "Go figure," Butch said sarcastically. "Well, that sucks," Mickey continued, commiserating. "It's not like you were taking advantage of a young innocent or anything. You were barely older than her." Butch looked up, his eyes boring deeply into Mickey's. "Crap like that happens every single day. Innocent people get messed up. That's life, princess. Accept it." "I did." "Did you ever see her again?" "Nope. I went to prison over that. She actually wrote me for a while, and then the letters just stopped." "So you hate her now?" "Nah. She told her father the truth. He chose not to believe her. Guess it disturbed his sensibilities that his little girl would fall for a commoner. He made sure the commoner would never get close to her again." He shrugged. "No, I don't I don't hate her. I can't blame her for having a life. I hope she's happy. Really." "So you're not such a hard and bitter guy after all, are you?" He stood. "I'm also not stupid. Sorry, little girl. You're going down. Accept it. All the talk in the world is not going to make me change my mind. I follow orders." Mickey's days. Oh, new scene. Sorry. New scene. Mickey's days in captivity had become a blur of monotony. Butch came in the room with the breakfast bar and water, took her to the bathroom, cuffed one hand to the bed for the day, and sat with her while she tried to talk to him. Peanut butter sandwich for lunch and a can of Beanie Weenie for dinner rounded out her menu. Another trip to the bathroom, then she was forced to lie down and both hands cuffed for the night. He stayed with her for the most part, reading his book or sometimes just staring out the window. Mickey wondered why he stayed. Maybe he thought it was the least he could do, keep her company until the time came. She wondered if at times he would give her a nice meal like they gave death row inmates. Maybe he stayed forward. Maybe he stayed because he thought he needed to keep an eye on her. Maybe he preferred her company over Richard's, whom she'd barely laid eyes on since they'd arrived at the camera. Not that she was complaining. She'd heard them arguing with each other several times, but she couldn't quite make out what they were arguing about. How much time did she have left? Would her stepfather even pay the ransom? He wouldn't want to, but he would do it to appear saintly in the public's eyes. It was these things Mickey pondered early one morning when everything drastically changed. She looked up when the door opened, expecting to see Butch, but her heart filled with dread when Richard appeared in the doorway, his slick smile in place. "Hey, gorgeous," he said with a grin. "Where's Butch?" Mickey asked shortly, trying not to let him know how much he scared her. "He's taken a walk before breakfast. Said you were driving him crazy, and I was out there thinking, like, while the cat's away, this mouse is going to play. You're not supposed to touch me. If you do, Butch will hurt you." "I ain't scared of him. You and me, we're about to be great friends." Mickey's breath hitched in her chest. Richard moved close to the bed and placed his hand on her knee. She jerked her leg, trying to knock his hand away, but he just laughed. "It's okay if you fight me. I like it when they fight." Tears welled in her eyes, and she cursed herself for being a big crybaby. "You wearing those tight little shorts and that short little shirt that shows your belly button, you know it tempts us guys. You do it on purpose. You ain't got no one to blame but yourself. I bet you ain't even got any underwear on under that." She didn't dare answer because he was right. Her running shorts were made to wear alone. He grabbed her and she tried to use her leg to kick him away from her. He only laughed. She tried again and ended up clotting him in the head. Furious, he was on her in seconds. Straddling her waist, he reared back and punched her in the mouth. Mickey saw stars. Her eyes started to close, but she forced them back open. He tried to kiss her, but she bit him. Cursing, he punched her again. This time, she realized she was losing consciousness. On the fringes of her awareness, she knew he was trying to remove her clothing. It didn't really seem to matter as she felt herself slipping away. She tried to cry out and to scream. She wasn't sure if she accomplished it. She heard a crash, and then suddenly he was off her. Mickey struggled to raise her head to see what was happening to Richard. Butch had him up against the wall and was bashing him with his fists. Lord, he was going to kill him. Richard's face was covered with blood. Butch had his hands around Richard's throat, just like she'd imagined them around hers. Then suddenly, he let him go, and Richard slid to the floor. Butch bent over and hauled the prone man over his shoulder and left the room. And when Butch returned, he came straight to the side of the bed and peered out into her face, blinking up at him. She couldn't think of anything to say, and it was a good thing, because she probably couldn't speak anyway. She looked into his eyes and... wait. Did she see a shred of compassion? Only then his eyes left hers and traveled the length of her body, and he didn't say anything, yet his breathing became heavier, and Mickey suddenly realized that he was considering finishing what Richard had started. Mickey didn't speak. Somehow, she realized he waged an internal battle, and she was afraid if she spoke, he would lose that battle. And then suddenly he reached up and unlocked her cuffs. "Fix yourself," he said gruffly. Mickey immediately straightened her clothing, and she started to cry tears of gratitude. "Thank you," she sniffed. He stilled, looking straight ahead. "I told you not to say that." Wisely, she stayed quiet while he took her through the morning routine, and when he led her to the bathroom, she glanced around quickly, looking for Richard, but she didn't see him. Once she'd eaten her breakfast bar, she curled back up on the bed, hugging her knees with her free arm. Butch sat in his chair but remained silent. Mickey's mind strayed over Richard's visit. Shuddering at the thought of his hands on her, she wondered where he was now. Glancing at the large man in the chair, her eyes welled with tears. It was weird that she could feel grateful to a man who intended to leave her for dead very soon. Lord, but she didn't want to die. Grown woman or not, she was terrified. Wiping at her tears, she cleared her throat. "Butch?" "Yes," he said softly. His answer took her aback. Usually he answered in a gruff monotone, "What?" When her eyes looked up at him, he was looking right at her instead of past her, but she wasn't going to fool herself anymore. She felt drained and defeated. She had no more energy to put toward thoughts of escape. Blowing out a breath, she realized that somewhere along the line she had accepted that it may happen, that she is going to die. And what did it matter? She was obviously expendable. She cleared her throat again. When it's time, I want you to be the one to do it, she said quietly. His gaze remained calm as he looked into her eyes. Slowly, he nodded his head. New scene. Jeff Davis's Jeff Davis pulled his truck up to the large ranch-style house that he'd bought a year earlier. Since that time, he'd been up to work on it only twice. No problem, because he wasn't in any hurry. The house was a dingy, pale yellow with white trim, no front porch to speak of. Instead, a few concrete steps led up to the door. Inside was a great room, a large open table, 3 bedrooms and 2 baths, and that was all. But he'd gotten a great deal. Included in that deal was the large lakefront that met his property in the back. Both times he'd been up to work on the house, it was actually back deck and dock that had occupied all his time. And it would again, for the next 2 weeks. Smiling, he jumped from the cab of his truck, grabbed his bags, and headed inside. He'd unhitch the trailer and unload the building materials after lunch. It'd been a long, tedious drive. Shoving the front door open, he dropped his bags and began opening windows to air out the stale smell. Flicking a switch, he was happy to see the power company had already turned on the power. Jeff turned his phone to some tunes, hooked it up to the mini speakers and cranked it up, then went to put away the kitchen supplies. He used his handy-dandy Clorox wipes to clean the counter, then peeked cautiously into the fridge, since he couldn't remember if he cleaned it out before he left the last time he was here. Phew, coast clear. It took him only 30 minutes to get unpacked and make some good old bologna and cheese sandwiches with sour cream and onion chips on the side. He rummaged through the cooler, bypassing the beer for now, and grabbed a soft drink. Popping the top on a Coke, he slid open the glass door that led out back to the deck he'd rebuilt on his last visit. He eased down onto the only piece of furniture, a wooden Adirondack chair. Sighing with pleasure, he took a few swigs of his Coke and sat it on the wide arm of the chair and bit into a sandwich. There was a breeze blowing in off the lake, and it ruffled his hair, cooled his body, and eased his mind. This was the life. Sunshine, fresh air, lake, fishing, building something with his own 2 hands. Once he finished building his dock, he intended to purchase a gorgeous Proline fishing boat he had his eye on. He breathed deeply as he imagined pulling that boat up to his newly built dock. Birds sang overhead as if they too imagined how nice it would be. He smiled. It was quiet here, at least on this part of the lake. He'd brought Laura up here with him on his last visit around Christmas. He remembered she'd talked incessantly about the fancy subdivision on the other side of the lake, the one with 3-story dwellings, the elaborate docks, and 2.3 luxury speedboats per home. He described to her his plans for his little house on the deck. He described to her his plans for his little home on the lake. She had been duly impressed because, at the time, theirs had been a new relationship. He realized now she'd merely been being polite. Apparently, the simple life was not for her. Money and prestige were more her game, more reasons why ending the relationship had been for the best. After lunch, he decided he'd unload the trailer, then take a swim, then scout out a good place to set up his shooting range. He glanced out to the left of his property. About 100 yards of open field blended into the far tree line. He could still see the old wood plank he'd nailed to one of those trees last time he was here. He'd wanted to show off for Laura. Again, she'd been duly impressed. He shook his head at the thought. He'd come better prepared this time. He brought targets and guns and his favorite rifle, and shooting was his thing. He hadn't been in the military, but when he'd done sniper school with the Meritech, he'd graduated at the top of his class. He could hit any target, moving or not. He chalked it up to the video games he played as a kid. It just came easy to him. He'd won a dozen or so awards in state and national competitions, stuffing the last crust of bread in his mouth. He stood. Enough dreaming. For now, there was work to do. The day was a scorcher. New scene. The day was a scorcher, and Mickey thought she'd melt before the sun started on its downward trek. Eyeing Butch, she wondered if he would allow her a shower. Man, oh man, it would feel so good. Why wouldn't he? She reasoned. It couldn't hurt to ask. He obviously liked to be clean. Each morning she could tell he'd showered and shaved. Contrary to how one would picture a criminal, he always dressed nicely, usually in black slacks and a white shirt. Butch? His eyes drifted from the window to her. Yes? There was that answer again. His attitude toward her had definitely changed. I was wondering, it's so hot, and I've been stuck on this bed for days now. Do you think I could take a shower? I promise not to try to run. It would feel so good to get clean. One last physical pleasure. She added that last part as a guilt trip. It must have worked. He rose and came to her, unlocked the cuffs, and pulled her up. She swayed briefly, dizzy since Richard had knocked her in the face. Breathing deeply, she cleared her head and nodded. He led her out of the room and toward the sofa where a towel lay over the back. Richard was there on the sofa. He glanced up at them briefly, then turned away. Mickey was surprised at the extent of his injuries. His face was one massive bruise. Butch grabbed the towel and handed it to her. It's been used, but it's the only one I have. And I don't have any girly shampoo, but you can use what's in there. Thank you, she said, smiling. I'm going to wash out my clothes, so don't come barging in if you think I'm taking too long. He nodded and pushed her into the bathroom and closed the door. Mickey wasted no time. She kicked off her running shoes and socks, and in just a few seconds she was in the shower, the warm water running over her face and hair. It felt so good, as she'd imagined. Just as good as she'd imagined. Grabbing up the cheap shampoo that was on the floor of the tiny shower, she lathered up her long brown tresses. The shampoo smelled so good, and she groaned with pleasure. She leaned her head back, closed her eyes, and rinsed her hair. Next, she scrubbed her body with good old Dial soap. It smelled heavenly, and when she finished with that, she did it again. Lather, rinse, repeat, she chuckled softly. When the water started to turn cold, she quickly used the shampoo to wash out her shorts, sports bra, and shirt. She didn't wash her socks because she didn't want to put them back on wet, and going barefoot was not an option, not when she wanted to be ready to run. The water was freezing now, so she stepped out, dried her body, and wrapped the towel around her head. She wrung out her wet clothes the best she could and pulled them back on, then sat on the floor and put on her socks and shoes, and finally she stood, moved to the sink, and gazed in the mirror. Her lip was swollen from being punched. It was the eyes that caught her attention, like the last time she'd gazed in the mirror. She didn't recognize herself. Everything had changed. Who was this person staring back at her with the haunted eyes? She continued to stare at the mirror, unable to look away. She felt as if she was supposed to be getting something, grasping some enlightenment. Maybe it was the writer in her trying to be philosophical. It was as if someone was trying to tell her something. Reaching out her hand, she placed it on the mirror, blocking out everything but her eyes. She leaned closer, looking deep into her own eyes. You're going to die soon, she whispered. It was so unfair, she thought. Yet was it? Butch told her to get over it. It happens all the time in life, and she was certainly no more special than anyone else. But darn, she wanted to live. Her hand balled into a fist and softly punched the reflection of her face. And then it hit her. She could break the mirror. If she could break it and take a shard of the glass, she'd have a weapon. She'd have to work quickly. The second Butch heard the glass break, he'd come barging in. It was worth a try, wasn't it? She didn't want to go down thinking that she could have done more to save her own life. She scanned the room. What could she use to break the glass? Eyeing the aluminum bucket sitting under the sink, she picked it up and tested its weight. It just might work. It was light, but if she swung with all her strength, she might be able to break the glass. She removed the paper towels and held the bucket up, made a couple test swings like a golfer getting ready to make the $1 million putt. She can do this, she told herself. This could mean life or death. Don't think about it too much. Just do it. And with that in mind, she reared back and swung. The glass shattered. Mickey dropped the bucket and grabbed at the glass, snatching the first shard she could as Butch came charging in. What the hell? He barked. She stood still, her hand beside her, inching the piece of glass up under the stretchy material of the leg of her shorts. I'm sorry, she said as pitifully as she could. I guess I just lost it. I was staring at my face, wondering how my life had come to this, and I guess I had a little temper tantrum. I'm sorry, Butch. I'll clean it up. Sighing, he shook his head. No, you won't. He jerked her arm, drug her back into the bedroom, cuffed her, then turned and left the room. Mickey quickly used her free hand to retrieve the precious shard of glass out from under the leg of her shorts and push it between the mattress and box springs. Drawing a deep breath, she tried to calm her racing heart. She'd done it. She succeeded in procuring a weapon. Now she just had to find the right time and the courage to use it. She could hear Butch in the bathroom tossing pieces of glass into the metal bucket. Her mind shifted to a time in the near future when she'd have to use her weapon on him and felt guilty about having to hurt him. Then she shook her head. He'd been calmly talking about killing me, she thought. The only difference is, at least I have a conscience about it. She wrinkled her nose. Then again, I won't feel a thing about hurting Richard. The moment Butch came back into the room, Mickey apologized again for the little mishap. Calmer now, Butch shrugged his huge shoulders. I can't blame you for feeling like breaking something. You've been through a lot this past week. You're holding up pretty well. Better than some I've seen. Her eyes met his, realizing he was speaking of others he'd killed. She felt sick. Butch sat and looked out the window. Have they sent the ransom note yet? Butch continued staring out the window. How much did your boss ask for? He turned back to her, abruptly stood, moved the chair close to the head of the bed, and sat back down. Mickey swallowed hard, thinking she'd angered him by asking the questions. Still, she wouldn't cower. She raised her brows and looked him in the eye. Well? There isn't going to be a ransom note, little girl. Moisture immediately gathered in her eyes, but she blinked several times, forcing back the tears. What do you mean? Why not? Look, I think you should know the truth before you die. It's a hard truth. I don't know why, but I feel like I got to be straight with you. Well, I know why. It's because killing people's not really you, Butch. I told you I think there's something good inside you. Stop it, he barked. Just keep your mouth shut and I'll answer your questions. He stopped and drew a deep breath. There isn't going to be a ransom note to get money from your stepfather because the man who kidnapped you, the man who's paying me to off you, is your stepfather. Mickey felt all the blood rush out of her face, felt her heart thudding in her chest. Her mouth fell open, but she couldn't speak. Thoughts raced through her mind. Glancing up at Butch, she could see that he spoke the truth. She shook her head at him as if in denial. He nodded at her. Yes, it's true. He wants you dead. But why? I mean, I know we never liked each other very much, but I didn't know he hated me so much that he would pay someone to kill me. What did I do to make him hate me so much? Her voice sounded pitiful, even to herself. She was on the verge of a breakdown, a big one. She knew he was a hateful, dominating, horrible, even sicko man, but she never thought that he would stoop to murder. There are several reasons why, little girl. From the way he talks, it started when you snooped in his office a few weeks ago and found information on the arms deal he made with the Saudis. It was then he decided to figure out a way to get rid of you. What are you talking about? I have no idea what you're talking about, she cried. Look, he don't talk that much to me. I only know what I've gathered from other conversations. All I know is he came home one day and you were in his office going through his files. I've never... Wait. A few months ago, I was looking for a copy of my birth certificate. I'd used my last copy for some classes I enrolled in and misplaced it. I thought to grab one from his office. He always kept several copies. He came in while I was there and asked me what I was doing. He was so huffy about it, I told him to kiss my butt. He says you were snooping. He says he couldn't take any more chances with you and you had to go. And he says what better time than an election year. He got excited as he realized that he'd have all the free publicity he could handle and the sympathy vote along with it. My father is having me off to get votes. This is crazy. It's real. Panic set in as she realized this ordeal won't be over until she's dead. Somewhere deep inside, she'd actually thought that there was a chance that once the ransom was paid, the police would close in and she'd be rescued. But dear Jesus, she was going to die. Her heart pounding, she eyed the large man. He was her only way out. You don't want to do it? I can tell. You don't want to kill me. He frowned. I'll do what I have to do. Why, Butch? Why do you have to do it? For the money? How much did they pay you? When he remained silent, she jingled her arm against the metal headboard to get his attention. I have the right to know, don't you think? She said, almost yelling now. That's what you said when you decided to tell me all this. You said I should know. How much, Butch? 200. 200? What? 200,000? That's it? That's all I'm worth? Wow, Butch, how could you? Huh? I don't understand, she cried. It doesn't make any sense. This isn't you. I know deep inside you're a good person. You're not a killer. He stood abruptly. You don't know what I am. I've killed before, and I will again. And you're not going to be able to reach inside me like I'm some Darth Vader person who still has some good in him. You have no idea who you're dealing with, and we'll just leave it at that. He drew a deep breath. Look, little girl, you're upset. You're angry, and you should be. Someone you trusted is someone who's supposed to be like taking care of you, decided that you're expendable. He sees you as a necessary loss for his greater good, and that's upsetting. So you go ahead and you vent all you want, but it won't change anything. Wiping tears from her cheeks, she blubbered at him. I don't want to die, Butch. Please let me go. Please. I won't turn you in. Stop it. Butch, you speak as if you have an education. You don't sound like some guy off the streets. What does that have to do with anything? So I read a lot. So what? Well, most educated people understand the value of a human life. I said stop begging. Why? Because I'm getting to you? Is my begging for my life making you uncomfortable? Well, then let me go. You can let me go. Or, her eyes lit up as an idea struck her. We could stage my death. Oh, Butch, we could stage the whole thing. And I won't resume my old life. I'll go off and be someone else. That could work. Don't you see? It really could work. Please, just let me go. We'll stage the whole thing and that'll get you off the hook. I said, stop it. Why, Butch? It could work. He shook his head. He'll want to see a body. He'll want to ID you. Butch, she pleaded now, her voice low. I don't care what you say. You have goodness in you and you're intelligent. Just think about it, please. Just give it some thought. He shook his head. There's nothing to think about. No, don't say that. There are things to think about. Don't say no yet. Please, please, Butch. Just say you'll think about it. Go over all the options. Just try to see if there's another way out. Please. He stood and closed his eyes and shook his head. Butch, okay, he interrupted. I'll think about it. Oh, thank you. Don't get your hopes up. Turning his back, he moved toward the door. I'll be back later with your food, he said without turning around. Mickey immediately did what Butch had told her not to do. Got her hopes up. She dared to hope that Butch might actually switch sides, that she might actually live, that one day she might even write the entire episode into one of her books. And then her mind went back to what she just learned. Her stepfather actually hated her enough to have her killed. How could she instill that kind of hate in a person? No, she refused to believe it was her. It was him. He was evil personified, and always had been as far as she was concerned. He believes he'll profit from her death. Well, she intended to fight to the bitter end. And while Butch was gone, Mickey used the time to practice pulling her weapon from underneath the mattress. If she were to take out both men, she would have to strike at a time when Butch unlocked the cuffs and both hands were free, like when she used the restroom, or when he unlocks her at night to get her situated on the bed before he locks up both hands. She tried to make her mind think of a plan, like who she should try to kill first. That one was easy, Richard. Once he was down, maybe Butch would be more willing to listen to her ideas. But how could she get to Richard when Butch had him terrified to come near her? Mostly, how would she be able to use this small, jagged piece of glass to get herself out of this predicament? All afternoon, she went over every possible scenario in her mind. Unfortunately, she was no closer to figuring out a way out than she was earlier. Butch came back into the room as the sun set, and for dinner, he gave her a can of ravioli. As she gulped it down, she realized she was starved. Never would she have dreamed a can of ravioli could taste so good. Butch was back to being silent, but his eyes never left her as he watched her eat. When she finished, she looked up at him. "Thank you," she said. He only sighed. They sat in silence. She knew he would take her to the bathroom soon and lock her down for the night. Had he reconsidered her idea? Him being so quiet made her think he'd already vetoed it. She'd been here over a week. There probably wasn't much time left. "It'll be soon, won't it?" she asked, knowing he would tell her the truth. "Yes. Once I'm gone, what will you do with my body?" "Dump it." He shook his head. "We'll take you somewhere so someone will find you, and then Daly will identify you, and the world will mourn your loss, and you'll have a funeral fit for a queen." "And you'll be $200 richer," she said bitterly. "It isn't for the money," he said softly. Her head sprang up, her body alert. "Well, then, what's it for?" He stood and unlocked her cuffs. "It's for my brother." "What? What about your brother? You said you didn't have any family." "I lied," he said as he grabbed her wrist and led her to the bathroom. Mickey hadn't been able to get Butch to say any more. He let her get freshened up, locked both her hands over her head, and told her to sleep. Then he'd taken his place in the chair, propped his feet on the end of the bed, flicked on his flashlight, and opened his book. Hours passed in silence other than the low murmur of the television in the other room. Mickey lay in the semi-dark, listening to Butch's breathing and the occasional page turning. Finally, she had to ask one more question. "Butch?" "Yes." "Will it hurt?" He didn't answer right away. He clicked off the light and sat in the dark for several minutes. "It'll hurt for just a second. One bullet in the head. It'll be over quick. I won't let you know when it's coming. You'll never know what hit you." She sniffed. "Thank you." He cursed softly. New scene. The air was warm and dry, making Jeff smile. Targets set with nothing but miles of woods behind them, rifles and handguns primed and loaded. Jeff took a deep, cleansing breath. He started with his Glock, squeezing off the first shots easily. He loved the way the sound echoed around his head. He loved the smell. He loved the kickback. It was going to be a good day. After target practice, he'd clean his firearms, eat some breakfast, and work on the large dock that was his ongoing project. Eventually, he'd have to get some buddies up to help with the bigger projects, but for now, it was nothing he couldn't handle. Thanks to Ameritech's regimen, he was solid muscle, so lugging around some timber and bags of concrete was nothing. Switching the gun to his left hand, he emptied it at the next target and then smiled. Oh, yeah, a great day. New scene. Mickey opened her eyes as Butch set a breakfast bar and a bottle of water on the table beside the bed. Beginning the day as usual with a trip to the bathroom, he unlocked the cuffs and stood back to give her room to rise, watching her as she rubbed the feeling back into her arms and hands. "You ready?" he asked. She nodded. Did you think about what I said?" "I said I would, didn't I?" "Yes. Have you made a decision?" He helped her up. "We might be able to figure something out." There was a sharp intake of breath as Mickey threw her arms around his neck. "Oh, thank you, Butch. Thank you. Thank you so much." The tears spilled over. He pulled her away. "Don't thank me yet. I don't know if it will work. We'll take the day to plan. We'll have to work fast. The order could come down any time." "It'll work," Mickey said, a huge smile on her face. "I just know it will." Taking hold of her left wrist, he pulled her to the door and opened it and stopped. That was unusual, Mickey thought. Why are we stopping? She tried to peer past Butch, but he seemed to be purposely blocking her with his body. You're making a big mistake, she heard Butch say, his voice fierce. No, I'm not. You made the mistake. We got the order. It's time. Mickey gasped and jerked on her wrist, but Butch had her held fast. Back up, Butch ordered. I'm not going anywhere, Richard drawled. Mickey screamed as two loud blasts filled the air. Butch jerked, let go of her wrist, and fell backward. Mickey stood face to face with the man who would take great pleasure in killing her. He grinned at her. I guess that takes care of that problem, he sneered. Mickey turned and dashed back toward the bed with Richard right behind her. She shoved her hand between the mattresses, felt the glass slice through her palm. Grimacing through the pain, she grasped the crude weapon tightly in her fist. Richard grabbed her and turned her around and pressed her back onto the mattress. Grabbing her hair with his hand, he held her still while he covered her mouth with his. Her stomach lurching, she pretended she wanted him and reciprocated the kiss. She could tell he was startled at first, and then he relaxed. As a sob rose in her chest, Mickey raised her weapon and sliced it deeply across his neck, aiming the best she could for his jugular. He gasped and tried to pull away, but she wrapped her other arm around the back of his neck to hold him in place and sliced again and again, terrified that what she was doing wouldn't be enough to stop him. Time seemed to slow. She could feel Richard's warm blood spray over her face. She could feel his legs kick, and then she realized a gurgling sound was coming from his throat. Her strength leaving her, she loosened her hold on him, and he slid off her and rolled onto the floor, holding his neck. Richard stared up at her with furious eyes. Blood seeped out from under his hand. Mickey couldn't move, couldn't take her eyes off him. His mouth was moving, yet no sound was coming out. Finally, her flight instinct kicked in. She inched away from him. He reached out toward her. Shrieking, she darted toward the bedroom door and landed flat on her face as she tripped over Butch's legs. Sobbing now, she scrambled to her feet. Her eyes took in the prone man who would have been her savior, his sightless eyes staring blankly. Blindly, she ran to the front door and threw it open and scampered down the porch steps. At first, she started to run down the road, then remembered her plan. If she ever got free, she couldn't let her stepfather know. She couldn't let anyone know until she could figure out what to do. Turning, she darted into the woods. It was the same woods she'd run into the first day when Butch had caught her. Butch was dead. She cried for him as she ran. After several minutes, she stopped trying to get her bearings. She noted the early morning sun on her left and figured she was headed south. She was pretty sure she was in California, though where in California she had no idea. She ran every day in her old life, which seemed very distant now. The most she'd ever run was a 10-mile mini marathon. As her mind started functioning again, she realized she didn't bring any water. Hopefully it wouldn't be a problem finding some. She may be in the wilderness for quite some time. Drawing a breath, she took off. As her body slipped into a running rhythm, her mind went back over the last half hour. She had probably killed a man. If not, she had hurt him bad enough to keep him from running after her. But Butch, poor Butch, he was dead for sure. He'd wanted to help her. Maybe he'd wanted to change his whole life around. So much was lost. But she couldn't think of that now. She was alive. Throwing her head back, she started to laugh. She was alive. She laughed hysterically as she ran without seeing. That proved to be her undoing. When her foot came down in a hole, the pain in her ankle sobered her immediately. She tumbled onto the soft forest floor and lay flat on her back, panting. The blue sky and sunshine shimmering through the trees somehow seemed to be the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen in her life. She'd seen it before, but never had she felt so much a part of the earth, so much a part of the essence of life. Her ankle throbbed, and sweat poured from her body as she lay there catching her breath. Common sense told her she had to keep going. Groaning, she rolled over, pushed herself up, and moved onward in a half-trotting, half-limping, broken gait. And as she ran, however, she thought she heard gunshots. Oh, no, he was following her. Heart racing, she picked up her pace. And that is the end of chapter 2.